Yes, when I came, there was in name an Institute for Research on Women and Gender, but it really hadn't been very active. And so one of the reasons I was hired was to make it active. And in the early years, it was, they weren't problems. So when they were problems, and they were sort of structural and bureaucratic rather than political, right? How do you produce a gender studies program that isn't isolated from the rest of the intellectual life of the university? That, of course, keeps its political edge, because gender studies, almost by definition, are about gender difference and gender hierarchy and the way gender difference is translated into hierarchy, right? But on the other hand, is really dependent on, in part, of the intellectual agendas of many, many, many disciplines. I would say all disciplines, although there's some we haven't penetrated. So the problem was figuring out how to accommodate the needs of the departments, and at the same time to produce a curriculum that allowed some students to make gender studies the center of their work, but also to have the power of the methodologies of the disciplines, or a discipline typically, and then conversely to have the students who are focusing on sociology or literature or something like that, the particular insights that can come from looking at the world as a gendered place. So those were the problems. One of the other problems was Barnard already had a real women's studies program, and we were dependent on it and worked in cooperation with it, but the Barnard curriculum is very different from the Columbia College curriculum. And so there were a lot of just bureaucratic and structural problems in figuring out, okay, how do you make gender studies available to a Columbia student who will have done all the core, which takes up a lot of time, but also prepares them in certain ways to do certain kinds of work that you can't assume a Barnard student has done. And I think probably our department, maybe more than any others, confronted the problem of the difference in the two curriculums in a way that probably almost no other department does. It was all worked out, but it took a lot of work. The interesting thing was that the other problem that faced me when I got here was there was no Black Studies program, there was no Ethnic Studies program, there was no program in Queer Studies. And so all of the demand for that kind of education tended to land on the Gender Studies department. We, in fact, had some curriculum development programs funded with outside money that were supposed to be about both race and gender, because it was the only place to get race seriously taken account of, or ethnic studies. Another problem we had was, sexuality and gay studies or queer studies. One of the things that has kind of plagued women's studies right from the beginning was that women were equated with sex. So that if you wanted to study the history of sex or, sexual practices, sexual orientation, it went to women's studies. And those were all pretty big agendas for one place to manage. But we tried. And it caused some tension in the feminist community, because then, what we could do on just straight women's studies was more limited, because we were trying to do these other things. And also because, certainly I and a lot of my colleagues didn't have the expertise. Now, over time, what's happened is, of course, we've built a vigorous African American Studies program, and there's ethnic studies around which there's still a lot of tension about how that should be structured. But there's more and more courses, etc., and at least a program. We don't have a center for the study of sexuality or anything, but the literature has expanded so much. And the other thing that's happened over the 20 years that I've been at Columbia is that the faculty with expertise in these areas has just expanded like mad. So there's no longer just one person who is supposed to know all these things.